Hello, everyone. I'm Sherry Mayhew, Resource Center Director for Huntington Society of Canada of Eastern Ontario. I'm very excited to welcome you all to our next guest, Dr. Bonnie Henning-Tressman, and the session we're here to view called Talking to Kids About HD. Dr. Henning-Tressman has over 30 years of experience providing and overseeing clinical services to patients and family members suffering from neurodegenerative, physical, and psychiatric illnesses. She is the director of Carillon Clinic's Huntington's disease program at Roanoke, Virginia, assistant professor at Virginia Tech Carillon School of Medicine in the Department of Basic Science Education, and the special programs director at HD Reach in Raleigh, North Carolina. She is on the board of directors as the research co-chair for Huntington's Disease Youth Organization, also known as HDYO, and the co-chair of the Huntington Study Group Credentialing Committee. This presentation covers a challenging but necessary aspect of facing Huntington disease as a family, talking to kids about HD. It will go over the reasons for talking to kids about HD, and you will learn the who, when, and how regarding talking to kids about HD and emotions. Finally, Dr. Bonnie will discuss different approaches of sharing information. We're keen to learn a lot in this session. Dr. Bonnie, you now have the screen.
Thank you so much, Sherry, and thank you again to the Huntington Society of Canada for inviting me to this very special virtual conference. So, talking to kids about HD. The topics of discussion, as was discussed, is understanding the reasons for talking to kids about HD, know the who, when, how, and what, learning about kids' emotions, and learning approaches of sharing information. So let's get right into it and talk about the reasons for talking to kids about HD. First of all, a child has a right to know about anything that does affect the family. By not talking about Huntington's disease, children learn not to trust. Children also do know that something is wrong. By not saying anything, they might have fears that are actually worse than the real situation. For instance, they might imagine that they did something to cause a family member to become ill, and in turn, they might develop anxiety and guilt. And not talking about HD leaves that message that it's a subject too terrible to discuss. Also, children might find out the truth from someone else. There are so many pieces of propaganda and things that are coming in on email, shared emails in families, or as I mentioned, mail that comes to the house that talks about maybe Huntington's disease or from one of these advocacy organizations. And children who are informed can be a comfort to you. You'll not feel that you have to spend so much energy into remembering what you told them if you're honest with them. Children also have an amazing ability and capacity to deal with difficult situations. Remember that fears are learned. So the fear that we have of telling children is really our own fear that we project onto them. And also, if the person with HD shows behaviors which now have an explanation, children will learn that this is normal and will continue to show affection and respect towards that person instead of being frightened. So who should tell the kids? Well, if you can, you should tell the kids about HD. And when I say you, it could be you as the person who has the gene for HD or has symptoms of Huntington's disease, or the other parent who is what I would call the well parent in this situation. If those two people are not an option, I do suggest a close family member or somebody that the child trusts who can also give the correct facts about Huntington's disease. As much as we want to sugarcoat information, it's really important that they are able to talk to somebody who's going to give them real information and who they can trust. And if those options aren't helpful or not available to you, then certainly having a professional who works with people with Huntington's disease could really help you as well. The caveat that I have with that, and when I do talk to younger people in my clinic, is I do say to the parents, I want you to at least mention the word Huntington's disease, because you might feel comfortable coming into my clinic or seeing me on video, but that child doesn't know who I am and doesn't know why they're going to be coming to see me or talk to me. So at least giving them some basic information can be really helpful. So when should I tell my kids? At any and all ages. In my book, Talking to Kids About HD, I do go over different ages and stages, but the take-home message is you can do this at any and all stages. Certainly, the younger the child is, the more basic the information should be. And also that when children are a little bit older and are adolescents, it might be a time for more specific questions where you really do sit down to talk to them. Again, the take-home message is it's not too early and it's never too late. So how should I tell my kids? When I talk to people about this, the first thing I do is I ask them, tell me how you learned about Huntington's disease, because there's a lot of layers there. And I think it's really important to be able to understand and look back at the way you were told about Huntington's disease. Were you in a family that this was open? Were you in a family that nobody talked about Huntington's disease? I think it can be really helpful because there's a lot of emotion behind talking to kids about Huntington's disease. So it's really helpful to be able to talk to a therapist, a healthcare professional, just in terms of all of this so you can work this through and then speak with your children. Also, you want to find a language that's comfortable to you. When I talked to a woman a long time ago, she said, well, I told my child that her daddy has a boo-boo in his head. And when the child was out on the playground one day at school, they fell and skinned their knee. And the nurse said, oh, you have a boo-boo. And the child was really upset because in her mind, it was a question of, wait, daddy has a boo-boo in his head. Is this what's going to happen to me? So we want to make sure that you do find language that's comfortable to you, but also sometimes labeling things as they are, as they should be, can be really helpful to differentiate so that the child doesn't get confused in the future. So I think it really is important, as I mentioned just a few seconds ago, that you might need to talk to different age children separately. But here's my caveat, here's my recommendation. It's really helpful to at least get all the children together so that they all know that this was discussed in front of everybody. And you go down to that lowest common denominator to say, we're going to give basic information. The reason behind this is that sometimes I do talk to families that they say, well, one of my children is really worries, or one of them might have special needs, or one of them might be too young, or I'm concerned about them. And then what happens is that there's a burden that's put on the other children. So either they're going to tell their sibling who the parent hasn't told, or they're going to hold that information from them and take on that extra burden. So I think it's really important that you can certainly give detailed information to different ages and stages, but I think it's really important to make sure that everyone in the family knows that everybody has at least some basic information about Huntington's disease. And when you are talking to your children, you should role play. You should practice what you're going to say and anticipate those really tough questions. And those tough questions can be, are you going to die? Is grandma, grandpa, who you're telling me has this disease, going to die? Am I going to die? And think about your answers and how you want to answer that. Again, it's really important that you don't give all kinds of information all at once, which I'll talk about, but you're just giving basic information and then moving on from there. Also, you want to find a comfortable and a familiar place to talk to the kids. So you might be a family that does chores or cleans up the kitchen so that you talk while you're doing dishes. Or maybe it is during a walk or during a quiet drive, or maybe you play games together or just have a little bit of quiet time. For some families, you just have to really find that time that really feels comfortable, because this can be one of those conversations that can be difficult. I had one family that decided that they were going to have this discussion in the car on their way to a mall or something like this, because she said, it was much easier to have this conversation while she was looking forward and the two children were in the back room, in the back of her car. So she didn't have to have this really difficult conversation. She can just say, when we're home, I'm going to tell you some information. So it was really helpful that she found a place that was right and comfortable for her. So what and how much should I tell my kids? I'm going to break this down a little bit. So the topics are going to be telling children information they can understand, listening to them, telling them how you feel, beware of what I call the don'ts, and some ways to actually talk to your children. So telling children information that they can understand. As I mentioned, you want to gradually share bits of information. I try to tell people to remember this as if you're feeding a baby food for the first time. We take a little spoon and we take a tiny bit of this little tiny mush and we give it to the baby, and we actually see if how the baby reacts and if they can swallow it and how they're going to kind of process this new information that's in their mouth. I want you to think about that with Huntington's. You don't need to sit down for hours and hours and talk to a child about all the different aspects of Huntington's disease. It's really just about giving little bits of information at a time and seeing if the child or children can digest it. Always, always, when you're having a discussion, leave them with a feeling of hope. When people come into my office, my private practice, or my office at Carillion, what I try to do is to make sure whether they're a child, whether they're coming in because they're at risk and they want to be tested, or whether they have the symptoms of Huntington's disease, that I always want to leave them with a feeling of hope. We know from a lot of the work that's being done now that there's lots of clinical trials that are going on, and there's a lot of hope for the future. So I really want to make sure that each time you talk to somebody about Huntington's disease, a child or even a family member or somebody else, that you do kind of focus on that positive of that feeling of hope. And also the bottom line is, do tell the children that they will always be loved and cared for, because they're going to be frightened if something happens to you or the other parent or whoever their caregivers are. Is that going to mean that I'm going to be alone? Is something going to happen to me? So do reassure, even if the child's not saying that they're concerned about that they will always be loved and cared for. So let's talk about listening to them. Answer questions simply. So when you talk about Huntington's disease, for you might want to get into CAG repeats and what everything means, but it's really about asking, when a child asks a question, just answer really simply. And then also what you can do, and I do this with adults in my clinic all the time. When I meet someone for the first time, I say, tell me your story. And then I say, tell me what you think HD is. And I think that that's really helpful if you're a family that this is an open discussion, that you can certainly say, we talk a lot about Huntington's disease in this family. If you were going to talk to someone who had no idea what it is, what would you say to them? How would you describe HD? Then you can correct things that aren't true, and there might be a few things. You can always ask them if they are worried about you or the family member with Huntington's disease. And again, kind of a trick that children do is that they'll say, well, I'm not worried. I'm not worried about you. And that's their way of protecting themselves and protecting you. But there's an answer that you can give to them to say, well, I'm glad to hear that you're not worried, but I want to let you know that when I heard about this, I was worried. I was really concerned. And I now know that if I ask questions and if I talk to people, that I'm a little less worried and I'm educated, and it makes me feel a little bit better. So you can lead in with that. Also, do look for those nonverbal cues when you know that your child has shut off, that they've had enough. It's really important not to give them too much information, because they're not going to be able to take all of that in. So your children and your family and the people that you are caregivers for well enough that if it just looks like it's too much, you can stop and then tell them that you do plan to continue discussion at another time. So it's not a one-time deal. So here are the beware of the don'ts. So don't lie. I know that as parents, as caregivers, as guardians, we want to protect children. That's what we want to do. It's our nature. It's our knee-jerk reaction. But if you do say to a child, oh no, you're never going to get this, and you don't know that they're gene negative, then there's a lot of resentment later on. And it can be really hard to have a trusting relationship with somebody who wants to protect you, but is not telling you the truth. Also, don't overburden them with lots of medical detail. So you can certainly say, well, we went to the doctor today and this is the information in 1 or 2 sentences. And then you can certainly say, did that answer your question? If not, and the child says, no, I want to know what this blood test said, or what the scan said, or what the doctor said in terms of what's going on with mom or dad, then you can answer that next question. But if the child says, yeah, that answers everything, then you're okay. Don't trouble children with financial concerns unless it impacts them directly. So if you are in a family that because of Huntington's disease or other illnesses or trauma, that there's going to be a change in what you can do as a family. Maybe you were taking 2 vacations a year, and because of, it could be COVID, it could be of a person's not working because of Huntington's disease. And you say, we do have to make some changes. We're not going to be able to go on those kinds of vacations anymore. That would be important to tell a child, so they don't think again that they did something to cause the family not to go on vacation. But if there's a lot of other financial concerns, please do make sure that you are not just out of earshot, because I do talk to a lot of families who say, well, the children were up in their rooms. They hear yelling, they hear people upset, they can pick up on all of these kinds of affect that people have. So do make sure that if there are some concerns that you have that are not going to impact children, that you talk to them, you talk to adults without the children even in the place, in the house or wherever you are. And don't make promises you can't keep. This one kind of goes back to a discussion I had with somebody who said, I told my children that I would never put their dad in a nursing home. And now I don't know what to do because I can't take care of him. And she felt really guilty. And for some people, they feel really resentful when they say, I made this promise. So, you can certainly say to a child, we're going to do everything we can to make sure that your dad's taken care of. I can't make you any promises because I don't know what's going to happen in the future. Nobody really does. So if something happens to me, or if dad needs a lot of care, we'll make decisions and I will let you know at that time when that happens so that we can make decisions together. And don't be afraid to say, I don't know. I don't know really just means two things. I don't know, but I bet you we can contact somebody who might know the answer. Or, as I just discussed, I don't know, and it's going to be in the future when we do know. So we're just going to have to wait together, but we are going to be together. And if you have any concerns, you can talk to me because I do worry about things in the future as well. And again, for some people, they say to me, I'm trying to have this discussion with my children. And I say, well, don't push your kids to talk. Give them a little bit of information, as I mentioned, and then you can go back and have some more conversations. You can also say this tip that I put down. I gave you a lot of information today. I know your friends can be a support for you, but not a lot of people know about Huntington's disease. So if you have questions about HD, I can put you in touch with HD experts. That way the children know that if they go to friends who are not going to have the answers, that can be really difficult, or somebody else who doesn't know, what Huntington's disease is, but that they also don't want to overburden you sometimes with some of these questions that they have. So being able to say there are people who we can ask questions, that can be really helpful. And I'll give you some resources at the end. So ways to say things. And as I said before, I keep this really, really simple. Mommy, daddy, aunt, uncle, whoever the caregiver has an illness, a sickness, and it's called Huntington's disease, and we call it HD for short. This illness makes mom, dad do some things that aren't exactly normal at times. Also, if you draw a family tree or talk to the kids about family members with HD, then they will understand that this is a family disease, and you don't have to immediately talk about at-risk status right away if that's not where the child is at, if that's not where you're at. But the child will be able to understand that there are people in the family with Huntington's disease as well, if that happens in your family. So, coping with the unknowns and uncertainties. There are, as we know, so many unknowns and uncertainties in dealing with Huntington's disease. There are some questions you are not going to be able to answer. But if you accept this, then you'll help your children accept this fact as well. But sometimes it's about finding out as much as you can to make the unknown more familiar. There are so many times people say to me, I just don't want to know anything about HD. And when I peel back those layers and say, why? What's going on that you have this concern? It's like it's all doom and gloom. Okay, well, if we educated you and told you a little bit more, maybe it would be not all doom and gloom. Maybe you will have hope. And in some situations, there are children who, again, because this is not discussed in their family, they think everyone's going to get this gene, and they don't know the truth. So sometimes being educated will also be helpful in terms of being able to cope. So let's talk about tips to deal with change. Let children know gradually that there will be changes in what the person with HD is able to do. Again, some of my examples are that if somebody's been diagnosed with having the gene and they don't have Huntington's disease until later on when the symptoms are there, you're not going to say, well, mom or dad is going to stop working. But, because that's too much in the future. But let's say that you're starting to have that discussion of it's more difficult for this person to drive or to go to work. So being able to say to a child, there are some changes coming. So it's not going to be right away, but gradually there's going to be maybe over the next couple of weeks where mom or dad is going to be home a little bit more, or eventually they're not going to be able to work. So if you introduce those things gradually, that's really helpful to deal with changes. Also, you do want to try to keep household routines as normal as possible without denying the illness. That could mean that mom or dad who's not working anymore does get up in the morning to help get everyone out the door, and then they're going to be home for an extended time for themselves. But that routine will help that person with HD to not feel so depressed and to keep structure, and it will be helpful in the household. Now, in terms of the denying the illness, we don't want to say, well, mom or dad shouldn't drive, but we don't want to upset the children, so they're going to drive the children. That wouldn't be a good way to cope with the changes. Another big one is asking for help, which is so, so difficult. And it's been really difficult for us during this pandemic for people to ask for help and to be together. But it's really, really important to be able to say to people, I think I need help now. I think I need to make some changes and to have people come into my life and to be able to help us cope with this. It can be also really helpful to be flexible when necessary. So you might have plans to go out or to do something. And as we know, sometimes people with HD will have kind of one of those, either a panic attack or anxiety or some irritability where they'll make a change. And again, if you could say to your child, all right, we're all going to go out, let's say to the movies or to dinner, but then know that mom or dad might have difficulty at the last moment. If that happens, we need to make some changes. So again, that's not your fault, but you have this flexibility. And I always tell people to have an emergency plan. This came up a long time ago with a family that I worked with. They were invited to a large event and they were really excited. And the person with HD was going to go with them. And they made all their plans and they got, dressed up and they had hair and makeup done and they were really happy. And at last minute, that person with HD said, I'm not going. Nobody's going. But the mom was able to say, she had her emergency plan in her back pocket and said, well, then our neighbor, Charlie, is going to be coming over and is going to be staying with you. So she had a discussion with Charlie weeks before to say, this might be last minute, but it's going to be really important. Are you going to be available? And Charlie said, absolutely. So of course, the person with HD who was staying at home was initially upset, but they settled down and the family did feel, a little guilty to say, we really wanted dad to come with us, but we understand that he couldn't. But that doesn't mean that we would have to make some changes. So this person had an emergency plan to say, I'm going to deal with this in case the situation arises. So let's talk a little bit about kids' feelings and reactions. There's lots of things that can happen. Kids can start to feel sorry for themselves. Why is this happening? Why is this happening in my family? Why is this happening to me? Kids may feel angry at the affected person for being sick. Kids may feel angry at the disease, but then take it out on the well parent. They might try to become super kid and set unrealistically high goals for themselves. They're going to get straight A's. They're going to come home. They're going to cook and clean. And we have had situations where there were very young children who were 10, 11, 12, who were caregivers for people with Huntington's disease. And you might know people in your family like that as well. Kids might feel scared and be fearful that something's going to happen to the sick person when they're not there, so they always want to be with them. They might withdraw in order to become independent in case something happens to their parent. I'm not going to be dependent on you. I don't need you. I'm going to be the man of the house when they're 9 years old. And those can be unrealistic. Kids might resent the fact that they need to take care of the affected person. Again, as I mentioned. Kids might make a joke about everything to cover up their real feelings about Huntington's disease. And some children will act out to get attention or might say they feel ill in order to stay with the affected person. And as we know, kids get sick. This is flu season, and a lot of people are going to be getting sick and kids are going to get sick. So we have to be careful, because if your child is saying continually that they have a headache or a stomach ache, and you check them out medically to make sure that there really isn't anything going on that they can figure out medically, then this might really be about guilt and anxiety. A child can't raise their hand and say, feeling a little anxious over here. Instead, they act out, or instead they say, I don't feel well, I want to stay home. So those are really kids' ways of saying, I need help. I need to talk to somebody. So it's really helpful to be able to reach out to your community and say, who can I get in to talk to this child? So what do you do when kids have all these kinds of emotions? Discipline. First of all, it's very important to continue to set firm limits with children. It is absolutely normal to see some acting out when there are changes in a family. And you can communicate with your children your love and acceptance of them, but not misbehavior. I do talk to so many family members who say, I feel guilty, so I sort of let them have the run. And I don't set these limits because I don't want to see anything bad happen later. It doesn't work like that. It's really important to set structure and set discipline. It doesn't mean that you can't show love and affection and concern for a child, but not to say, you know, they're free range and to say, I feel guilty that they might have this gene, or even a child who has juvenile onset HD to say, I'm not going to set any limits because of that. That's not always helpful. You do want to reward good behavior and let them know how much you appreciate their help. And do set limits with the internet. It is so important in terms of social media, in terms of everything that it's out there. One great site, obviously, and part of the resources that I will give you is certainly HDYO, as was mentioned, Huntington's Disease Youth Organization, which is a global HD organization written by young people for young people, and it can be really helpful to reach out. So we have mentorship, we have people that you can talk to as a parent, we have people who are professionals, we have people who call in as professionals to say, how can I help this person in my community? So that's a really, really good. It can be really, really frightening. A lot of times parents will say to me, or caregivers will say to me, my child is not exposed to Huntington's disease. But then when I start to talk to a child, they heard about HD or Huntington's disease, and they start to look up things. And what they look up is scary. We know it's scary for us when we just do a search and say, oh my gosh, there's awful things out there. But if you go onto the internet with a child and say, let's stop at a couple of these sites and let's get information about HDYO or HD Buzz, any of these sites that are really give good information, that's correct information, and then let them know you might look up some stuff, and a lot of the stuff can be very scary. Or you might look up some stuff, and what's good for one person, what we call anecdotal, what's their story, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be good for everybody. But because people can put almost anything on social media, a lot of times that is the stuff that comes up. So it's really important, even if your child doesn't bring these things to you, that you actually mention it to them. Sharing. Try to do lots of things together as a family if you can. I understand for everybody that can be different. For everyone, it's not the same, and it can be different. But family is different for everybody. We have chosen family. We have people we want to be around that are not blood relatives or not family by marriage. But family can be really a loose term of a chosen family. So try to do things together as that chosen family or the blood family, and try to make memories. Laugh together. Laughter truly is the best medicine. Maybe making up an inspirational slogan together and posting it around your home. I had one woman who made a slogan. She said, I have a lot of living left to do. And that was important to her when she looked in the mirror and she saw that when she was having a down day. But there are lots of families who just post these little things for each other or just as a reminder for themselves. And share stories and uplifting experiences. Make those memories. When you create positive memories, you teach children that it's okay to have fun even when they're sad. And do know that there is a bit of a silver lining. Children can grow in their ability to face difficult experiences. Nobody wants to have HD in their family, but I have met so many incredible, resilient, wonderful people in the 25 years I've been working with people who have Huntington's disease. And I know that when people say growing up in a family where there's HD, they have made lifelong friends and have wonderful abilities. So for a lot of people, children might become more self-confident and independent because this is openly discussed. They might become more responsible. They might become more sensitive to others' needs. They may grow in their ability to understand and love another person, even if that person is different. So the last slide are some resources. And it's not a holy grail. It's not that you have to try to get your child to go on to HDYO or get them into a clinic. These are just some resources. There are electronic copies of my book, Talking to Kids About HD. And if you just Google Amazon Kindle and look up Talking to Kids About HD, you do not have to have a Kindle to read the book. Also, as I mentioned, HDYO, which I am very much a part of, and I have many resources on that site. And there are just wonderful people who are associated with HDYO. They are available. And also, obviously, YPAD, the Huntington Society of Canada, has your YPAD. HDSA has a National Youth Alliance, and you can go to the publication list and get some information. And as I mentioned, there is a mentorship program between HDYO and HDSA for the Americans. as well as the Huntington Society for Canada, YPAT, also has a mentorship program that's very successful. So these are some resources. And I just gave you a smattering of talking to kids about HD. And I'm hoping that you will now have some more tools in your toolbox so that you feel just a little bit more comfortable talking to your children and your family about Huntington's disease.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bonnie, for your presentation and such invaluable information. Absolutely terrific. We have a few minutes now. I'm just cognizant of the time. We do have a few minutes for questions and answers, and I encourage all of our participants to be able to type in some of their questions into the chat box. To kind of get the ball rolling, I have a few questions that I would love to know about. Let's say I'm a family member and I've been having conversations with my children, but I fear that I did it all wrong. What do I do now?
Yeah, this is a great question. And inevitably, somebody will come up to me at a conference or through some of the virtual conferences just to say, I feel like I did it wrong. And I always give the same response. I say, you didn't do anything wrong. You did the best you could with the information you had at that time. So beating yourself up is not going to make it better. You did the best job you could at the time. But what you can do now is to say to your children or to say to yourself, this is a jumping off point. I learned something. And you can then go to your children and say, well, I talked to you a little bit, but I think I need to give you some more information. I just learned at a conference that it really can be helpful for me to be open with you. And maybe I wasn't asking you enough questions. Maybe I was. And I just want to check in with you to see if all of your questions have been answered. So you can certainly say and go forward, because as I said, it's never too early and it's never too late, that you can go forward and say, I learned some information and I think it's really important that I have an open discussion with you. So here's a situation, whether you've never talked to them and you do know about Huntington's in your family and you never talked to your children, or as you mentioned, you talk to them, but you don't know if you did everything the right way. Maybe you said, I told them they would never get this, or I promised that I wouldn't put their dad in a facility. You can say, I need to be honest with this. That's my hope. But going forward, I need to be open and honest with you. And I learned that this is really an important thing to do. So hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you so much. I was interested in knowing a little bit more about the emergency plan. And when exactly do you start crafting an emergency plan? Is there a right time?
I think there's always always time for an emergency plan, and not just with Huntington's disease. You always want to have something in your back pocket to fall back on. So for some people, let's talk, certainly about Huntington's disease, families who have a loved one, there is some irritability, or that that there's some issues with behavior, that's definitely a good time to have an emergency plan. Emergency plans can mean lots of things. First of all, for an emergency plan, I think it's really helpful for people to have a list of resources of who are the people in my person with Huntington's disease care team. So you have names of people who you can contact, when you can contact them, for what reasons would you contact them. If the person's in a study, I think that's really important to know. Having a list in terms of all medications, how much medication they take and when they take it, as well as what it is for, is really important. And then being able to have emergency plans when you're planning to do something. So it could be something as simple as the example that I gave about going to the movies. I had one family that said, we were going to the movies, the children were allowed to bring a friend, and then the mom was really having some behavioral problems. And the dad took the kids aside and said, okay, we know that this is Huntington's disease. She's not mad at you. We're not mad at her. We're mad at Huntington's disease. So let's do something different. Mom's got to go to her bedroom and we're going to have just a movie night, a Netflix night. I'm going to make popcorn and we're going to make a fort in the other room. And we're going to do the best that we can. This isn't about, us being mad at mom. She's really having a hard time right now. Excuse me. And I need to be around here. So that's kind of a soft emergency plan, or just a flexible plan. But I think always having that backup plan when there's something big going on can be really helpful. That could be just going to a visit to a healthcare provider for a visit to say that person, with Huntington's disease might really fight that person. Is there an emergency plan that you can call somebody? It might be that you're really close with that person with Huntington's disease, but all of a sudden, if a cousin comes over or the next door neighbor that they speak to, they might be able to pull it together where they're not so anxious and so irritable. So having that emergency plan to say, it might work this way. My hope is that it works this way, but we're going to have something in the back pocket in case it's needed. And if it's not needed, you don't go there. Did that answer your question?
Such great information. Thank you so much. I feel so much more empowered. We do have time for one more question, and I'm looking at it in the chat. And the question is, do you have any suggestions for when communication approaches are very different between some family members? So perhaps, for example, one adult sibling might be ready to hear and have conversations, and the other sibling may not. How do you navigate those situations?
Again, such good questions. We have families where, especially with social media, that cousins across the nation are talking to each other across the world. And it's really hard to say, I'm going to tell my kids. So I have adults who have had this conversation. I'm going to tell my kids, I can't stop my kids from telling their cousins about this. So I just want to let you know, I'm going to be talking openly about Huntington's disease to my children, and I want you to be aware. So that's one thing. In terms of the situation that you mentioned, I'm going back to that whole discussion of being able to say, I'm going to give this information to everybody, just some information. And there might be that one child or adult child that just needs to get more and more information. They want the details, and that's okay. And you can certainly say to that other child, I understand that you might not want to hear this information. This is medical information that's really important. I can't force you. I can't force you to talk to anyone. I can't force you to go and get tested if it's appropriate, but I want you at least to have the bottom, the least information that you need to know that this is in your family, in our family. And your sister, brother might want to talk a lot about it. You might not want to. That's fine. So again, I think it's really important, again, because I do have family members who say, I have one child who has special needs or worries a lot. But again, telling one child and not the other can really cause some issues down the road. Number one, you don't know if they've talked to that other child, the child that you talked to, gave that information, or just the burden that one child has to carry. So I think it's really important to have some open conversation. That child that worries a lot, maybe they do have a therapist or somebody that they talk to. And it might be that they're worrying a lot because people around them, also aren't talking to them so much. Knowing that they have a healthcare team that can help them, it's important to let that healthcare team know that this is going on so that resources can be there to help that child as well.
Thank you so much. I think I can squeeze in one last question, and it's from the chat, and it says, one thing that I've been finding especially difficult is explaining to my son that HD is ultimately fatal. How do you have those, or how do you navigate those types of conversations?
Yeah, these are all good, really, really good questions. So again, at the very first, it could be really a lot to sit down and say, oh, daddy has HD and, eventually he's going to die from this. And there are some people who have these open conversations, and that's fine. But for some, it's, that this is a disease that gets worse over time, and we think it's pretty slow moving. But, as time goes on, a child can see the difference of what that person with Huntington's, or the symptoms of Huntington's, is starting to get worse and starting to introduce that concept. I do work also with some children who have a sibling with juvenile onset HD. And in the world, a lot of times people don't think about a child dying, a child who is dying, and then having a sibling see that child get worse and worse. So that's also when we're introducing this, your sibling is getting worse, and this is what our expectation is. So again, not too early, but knowing that they're not able to work anymore, they're not able to drive anymore, it's a little bit harder for them to take care of themselves or to feed them. We need to maybe all learn the Heimlich maneuver at some point. We need to make sure that we all know how to dial 911, and to know that this is, we're going to hope for the best. We're going to hope that there's some things to treat the symptoms, and maybe some disease modifying treatments. That's a whole different story. But, we do know also that they're going to start getting worse. And, as that goes on, starting to introduce that concept. It's not something you want to do all at once. Again, unless you're a family that just talks about everything all the time. But But I think just introducing things little by little over time and saying, this is hard for me because I know dad's getting worse. I'm wondering if you're thinking about these things too. And what do you think is going to happen in the future? And what are you most concerned about or worried about? That will at least open the door to these conversations.
Thank you for that. I know as a resource center director for Eastern Ontario, I'm always interested in resources. What can I look forward to by looking at your book and kind of thumbing through it, talking to kids about HD?
Yeah, thank you. A lot of what I just talked to you about is going to be in there. I do, as I mentioned, go over the different ages and stages for children. For instance, children of a certain age are going to be thinking that they did cause something, that they were in the grocery store and mom didn't buy them the candy bars, and I hate you, I wish you were dead. And then if somebody gets sick, it's like, oh my gosh, I did that. So really making sure that people understand the ages and stages of talking to kids about Huntington's disease. And there's lots of examples. So the interesting part for me is when I wrote the book many years ago, the first edition, when I started speaking internationally, I thought that people weren't going to be able to identify. They wouldn't, if in one country it was going to be different than it was in the United States. And when I found across the world, people saying, oh my gosh, these examples are exactly what I'm going through. So it was really helpful because people were able to feel validated and to say, this has happened to me. And there was one woman who I did a conference a long time ago. And then years later, she saw me at a different conference. She said, I've been carrying your book around for 10 years. And it was so wonderful because she said, I just needed this as a transitional object to say, I can do this, that I have some steps here that I can go back to, whether it's reviewing this webinar, reaching out to people at HDO or YPAD, or if you're in the States and NYA, and just saying, I can do this. I have, as I said, the tools in my toolbox, and it's not perfect. And my situation is unique. Everyone's situation is unique, but I feel that I have the confidence to move forward, knowing that this is enough. People, the discussion about talking to kids about Huntington's disease is important enough that we have books and resources and webinars and websites to give you that confidence that you want and you should have.
Thank you so much. Such an informative presentation and a fantastic question and answer period. So I thank you so much for your time, Dr. Bonney.